all of your demands, or does negotiate actually mean something? And they kept saying, when Israel is serious, we will negotiate. Then on January 2nd, 2007, 6 months after the abduction, we hear word that there was a breakthrough in the negotiations and that a framework agreement had been reached. Gilad Shalit would be exchanged for 1,000 Palestinian prisoners. The deal would be done in 2 phases. In the first phase, Israel would release 450 prisoners selected by Hamas. In a second phase, Israel would release 550 prisoners selected by Israel and approved by Egypt. In October 2011, this was the deal. This was the deal. It was made in January 2007. 1 week later, fighting exploded in Gaza between Fatah and Hamas. Egypt began mediating between Fatah and Hamas, and not between Israel and Hamas. As frustrated as I was, I used every opportunity I could to reach out and try to influence the process. As my friend, the Egyptian intelligence officer, told me, Nadir al-Asser, keep trying, don't give up. I was at a conference in Madrid, marking 15 years since the famous Madrid conference of 1991. All the original delegations in the Madrid conference were there, that conference that was brought together by George Bush the father and Gorbachev, when Yitzhak Shamir was there. And there was a delegation from Syria there, the same Syrians who were at the original Madrid conference. Riyad al-Daoudi, the legal advisor of the president's office, and Buthaina Sha'ban, the spokesperson of the Syrian government, and I, together with Akiva Aldar, walked into a lift in the hotel we were staying at. Akiva outreached his hand to Daoudi and introduced himself. I'm Akiva Aldar from Haaretz, can I interview you? Well, Daoudi got flustered and pushed a button on the lift that let him off at the next floor, getting off before his own floor. He wouldn't talk to an Israeli. I approached a Palestinian colleague at the Madrid conference and asked him if he would speak to the Syrian delegation about speaking to me. Perhaps they could influence Hamas leadership in Damascus through the office of Assad. Well, Daoudi agreed to see me, and I met with him behind a curtain. I explained to him what was going on. I asked him if Bashar al-Assad would influence Hamas to negotiate with Israel for the prisoner release. He acknowledged our conversation, turned around and left. The answer that I got was that Hamas would have to deal with its own business. This was not the business of the Syrian government. At another conference I was at in Turkey in April dealing with regional economic development, I spent 3 days sitting next to Dr. Samir Taki. Samir Taki is a cardiologist from Damascus, a schoolboy friend of Bashar al-Assad, and when Syria and Israel were conducting what was called proximity talks through the help of the Turkish Foreign Minister Ahmed Davutoglu, Samir Taki was one of the 2 negotiators. Sat with him 3 days at a conference in Ankara. On the 3rd day, I told him about Gilad Shalit and asked him if he would speak to Bashar al-Assad. He gave me his email. We communicated. He later told me the same answer that Daoudi had given, that this is a Hamas affair and that the Syrians would not intervene in it. In the beginning of May 2007, civil war broke out in Gaza. By June 7th, Hamas had conducted a coup d'etat in Gaza. They had thrown out the Fatah forces, the forces loyal to President Abbas. Abbas declared the government in Gaza an illegal government. Israel declared the Gaza Strip an enemy territory. Ahmed Jabri, the head of the Ezzedin al-Qassam, the military wing of Hamas, emerged as the strong man in Gaza, the person who forced Abbas's forces out of Gaza and took control of Gaza in the name of Hamas. Egypt closed its embassy in Gaza and withdrew its personnel from the Gaza Strip. Now, there was no Egyptian negotiator either. On June 24th, a couple of weeks after the coup d'etat, I call Ahmed Yusuf and have a long conversation with him and say to him, we know that Shalit was alive until the coup d'etat in Gaza. We don't know if he's still alive. How about providing another sign of life? Let us try and renew something. There's no Egyptian negotiations. Let's see a confidence-building measure with a sign of life. Now, I have no idea if this is connected to me or there are other forces to play, but the very next day, Hamas issued an audio tape where we heard Gilad's voice for the first time since his captivity. I looked at these guys, Ofer Dekel and his colleagues, a whole team of officials from the Mossad, the Shin Bet, the military, a whole staff, and I wondered to myself, what do they do when they get to work in the morning? I couldn't figure out what the whole team of people working on this. What do they do? The Prime Minister was telling us, we're doing everything possible. The state of Israel is doing everything possible. That's what we heard all the time. We will not leave a stone unturned. We will bring Gilad Shalit home. And I knew that absolutely nothing was happening. I knew from security officials that Israel knew where Shalit was located, that they knew where he was being held, and that they were planning the military operation. I know later that twice they tried a military operation. Once the military operation was called back before it got to its site. The second time it never left because they knew that the place was booby-trapped and the soldiers rescuing Shalit would be killed along with Shalit. On August 8th, 2000, Razi Hamad called me and he proposed a secret direct back channel with Israel. I called up Ofer Dekel and told him about the offer from Hamas. He was willing to continue it, but several weeks passed and there was no official answer. By the time he came back to me saying that Israel would be willing to enter into a secret back channel, Hamas's response was no. November 7th, the attention of the world shifts to Annapolis, a new peace process. President Bush, Condoleezza Rice are bringing together the Israelis and Palestinians for another round of peace talks. Abbas tells the Americans and the Israelis, you can't negotiate with Hamas now a deal while we're negotiating peace. You have to empower me, the moderates, and not the extremists. All negotiations are off. During the time when there's a chance that the Annapolis process might produce an Israeli-Palestinian agreement, the talks with regard to Gilad Shalit are completely off the agenda. No one's talking about it. No negotiations are taking place. During this period, Gaza is entirely forgotten. It's under siege. And when Hamas feels forgotten, they launch rockets. So they started shooting rockets at Israel again. And of course, Israel retaliates. And then Egypt steps in and tries to work out a ceasefire between the two sides. This is the pattern that's repeated itself over the years. Olmert rejects the ceasefire offer. I, in fact, get a phone call from Hamas offering a package deal, a ceasefire, an end to the siege, and a prisoner exchange. And I deliver the message to Olmert, and he rejects it. He tells his daughter that we can't trust them to honor a ceasefire agreement. On May 14th, Hamas demonstrates that it has better technology, long-range missiles, and the first long-range missile hits Ashkelon, and Israel retaliates, and there are more Hamas fires. Then, suddenly, July 16th, 2008, we hear that there's a deal with Hezbollah for the two soldiers abducted to Lebanon. A prisoner exchange for the two Israeli soldiers. Israel released 4 Hezbollah fighters captured in the 2006 Lebanon war, and the bodies of 199 Palestinian, Lebanese, and Arab fighters captured by Israel in the past 3 decades, and Samir Kuntar, who was the murderer of the Haran family. He had been convicted of murdering an Israeli policeman on the beach in Nahariya, Eliyahu Shachar, and Dani Haran, Haran's 4-year-old daughter Einat, who he killed with a blunt force of a rock. He was also convicted indirectly of causing the death of 2-year-old Yael Haran, who was suffocated by her mother as she held her to be quiet while Kuntar was in their house in Nahariya. This was very traumatic for Israel. Needless to say, Samir Kuntar went back to Lebanon as a hero, and we received the bodies of 2 Israeli soldiers. There was a moment in Israel, although we had been prepared that the 2 soldiers were probably dead, there was a moment of hope that maybe one of them was alive. wounded, in bad medical situation, but when we saw the two bodies coming off the Red Cross truck and being transferred to Israel, I remember, at least for me, and I think it was shared by most people in Israel, a moment of deep trauma, and a moment when I, and I think most others, were thinking about Gilad Shalit. Is this how Gilad Shalit will come home as well? Dr. Gerhard Konrad, a German intelligence officer, had negotiated the deal with Hezbollah. He was an expert on Islam. He had studied about Hezbollah. He had successfully negotiated the deal, and the Israelis asked Angela Merkel, the Chancellor of Germany, if Gerhard Konrad would take over the case of negotiating with Hamas. Merkel agreed. Hamas agreed that Konrad would negotiate. The Egyptians insisted that the negotiations be held under an Egyptian umbrella so that they remained in the picture, but the negotiations would be carried out by Gerhard Konrad. Angela Merkel provided him with a private plane, with a staff, with all the resources necessary at the account of the German people. They never asked for a penny in return, and Konrad started his mission with a fervor, with a great deal of energy. He was flying in and out of Israel and into Gaza and to Cairo, and there was a sense that progress was being made. But there was political turmoil in Israel. On July 30th, Olmert, after being threatened with indictment, announced that he will step down as the leader of the Kadima party, and new elections would be held for the leader of the Kadima party. September 17th, Livni won those elections, Tzipi Livni. On September 21st, Olmert resigns from the office of Prime Minister, but remains the lame duck acting Prime Minister until Livni could create a new coalition, which he failed to do. From November to December, with no negotiations progressing at this point because of the political turmoil in Israel, Hamas starts once again shooting rockets into Israel, 200 rockets during this period, and of course Israeli retaliation. On December 27th, Israel launches Cast Lead, which we all remember. Israel knew where Gilad Shalit was located until after Cast Lead. After Cast Lead, he was moved, and Israel lost the whereabouts of Gilad Shalit. The internal politics, with no negotiations and no deal. February 10th, we have elections in Israel. This is a mistake. Netanyahu didn't win the elections. Tzipi Livni won the elections, but she couldn't form a coalition government. Netanyahu formed a coalition government. During the period when he was negotiating, and Olmert was still the acting prime minister, I pleaded with Hamas one more time. I said, make the deal now. You don't know Netanyahu. You don't want to negotiate with him. This is the man who wrote the book on terrorism. You don't negotiate with terrorists. Make the deal now with Olmert. I appealed to them. I sent a letter off to the leadership in Damascus. Netanyahu said to Olmert, I don't want Gilad Shalit's picture on my desk. Finish this before I come into the Prime Minister's office. But Olmert left office. There was no deal. I don't know if you recall, but the day before there was a huge demonstration in front of the Prime Minister's office, and the Shalit family was completely broken when the deal wasn't made. The cabinet voted against a deal. Olmert voted with those opposed to the deal. Beginning of April, Ofer Dekel resigns from being in charge of the case. New Prime Minister, new man. Chagai Hadass is appointed. Former deputy head of the Mossad, not promoted to be head of the Mossad, leaves office, is called back to take over the Shalit file,